I have become obsessed with the possibilities of combining LEDs and epoxy. So when I realized I could program LEDs to twinkle like stars, I saw it as a perfect opportunity to create a Starry Night table. I'm Jason, and this is Learn, Build, Repeat. LEDs can be difficult to work with, or more accurately, they can be difficult to use in a project and not have it look tacky. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, as we've all seen LEDs used in places they shouldn't have been. Here in Texas, every so often I'll see someone driving around with a squatted truck, usually pretty banged up, with LED strip lights wired all over the chassis. And this is exactly what I'm trying to avoid when I use them, which is why I think stars work so well. Think about it. Stars are singular points in the sky. LEDs are singular lights on a strip. Stars are mostly white, sometimes blue or red. LEDs can be pretty much any color. They just seem like an elegant way to combine the two. In the making of this Starry Night table, I hit a constellation somewhere in it. I'll pin the comment of the first person who gets it right, so comment below. The dimensions for my table are going to be 50 inches by 25 inches, as it's intended to be a coffee table. While I like building full-size tables, given the number of stars I want and the gallons of epoxy I'm going to have to use, I figured this would be a good size, at least for now. My plan was simple: edge band the plywood, paint it black, cut up all the LEDs and place them down in a star pattern, and then solder them all together. So I'm not sure how I'm going to lay out the LEDs in order to mimic a star pattern. I have a reference photo here on my laptop, which I'll show you. So I'm just going to try and roughly follow this pattern and replicate it on the blackboard. Never done this before, so I'm just going to try it and see how it goes. I just finished laying out all the LEDs, what I think will be a good star pattern. There's 220 LEDs in the end, and honestly, that's going to generate a ton of work for me soldering. But let me show you what I did first, and then we'll move on to the next part. I just tried to lay them out as, randomly as I could to kind of mimic a star pattern. And I did hide in a constellation in there. And this will be the last LED. The power cables will come through here. And now I have to do something that's going to be incredibly tedious, but incredibly important. And that is I need to start soldering. So I'm going to share with you how much work this is going to be. So look at this. Look at one of these LEDs. See, there's 6 pads. So the way that you solder these is you first tin the pads. So you put a little solder on each of those little copper pads that you saw. So 6 per LED. And then you have to tin the wire. So that's again another 6 per LED. So I have to do 6 plus 6 times 220. That's like 2,300. Holy crap. I have to do 2,300 like soldering connections. So this might take honestly a couple days. But I'm going to put on a time lapse for you guys so you guys can just sit back and enjoy. For about the next week, I spent all my nights after work soldering all of these LEDs together, only to find out that I was going to have to throw it all out and start over. Just realized something terrible happened. I was testing the LEDs last night because I just couldn't sleep, so I was just playing around with it. And it turns out that the first about 200 LEDs on this strip just don't work for some reason. Like, I was trying to just get them to start blinking red as like a test of what I've soldered up so far. And none of them were blinking red on this part of the board, but the last few actually worked. In fact, I tested all the LEDs, like all these LEDs up until this point, and this is the first LED that starts working. So from here, it kind of like snakes back and forth up to here. All those LEDs are working, but every single one on this side doesn't work. And it's really disappointing because I spent a week on this so far because there's so many little connections. There's like 1,000 of them or so. And the way I found this is I made this little tester thing that all it does, if you hook up those little guys through the electrodes of an LED, it'll start blinking red. So let me show you what I'm talking about here. Okay, so this is incredibly janky. Don't recommend it, but if we connect it the right way, this guy should blink red. Or turn red. Okay, so that's working. That's what it's supposed to do. This one? Nothing. All of these are just nothing. Sometimes you just get like a blue or something. I have no idea why this is happening. I think I just got a bad batch. Like, there's no reason why the first 200 of these LEDs wouldn't work and then the last 20 would work, other than just a bad batch. Like, I thought maybe I was pressing too hard on these ones or they got too hot. But I tinned the LEDs on the right just like the left ones. And I didn't really press on any of the corner ones here at all. Like, that's because I was leaning over the table and those ones are not working. So, and these ones are. If you guys know why this is happening, just leave me a comment in the comment section below. I want to know. I'm not certain that it's a bad batch, but that's my best guess so far. So now the next step is to redo everything. So what I have here is a bunch more LEDs. So these are 150 LEDs. These are about half as dense as the LEDs that come on this strip. But honestly, I don't think I have it in me to spend another 2 weeks cutting all these LEDs and soldering them all together, because it's honestly a crazy amount of work. So I figured out a better way to do this that should give a similar result. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to buy, so I have 150 LEDs here, and I've had Amazon overnight deliver me another 3 of these. So I should have 600 LEDs in the end. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put these on a grid pattern, just big strips, way easier to put down, way easier to solder because you're not soldering individual ones. And I'm going to do a grid pattern. And then in the code that I'm going to write after this, I'm going to turn off some of the LEDs such that it looks like star groupings. That's the plan. I'll control it in code rather than on the hardware side, because it's way easier to do it in the code. So I'm going to rip off all these LEDs, all this work that I spent the last week doing, and I'm going to start putting some of these down. Let's get to it. There's a tape backer on all the LEDs, and the fastest way I found to remove them was to use a heat gun and a scraper, and they just came right up. Then after a quick sand and another coat of black paint, I had a blank canvas to start over with. Even this next step took me about a day, and I was only putting down 17 large strips of LEDs instead of 220 individual lights. I also included 3 power injection lines at equal intervals to help prevent voltage drop so the LEDs would be as bright as possible. One problem that I knew I had to figure out was how to seal the hole for the wires. I wanted my power box to sit underneath the table with a switch to control everything, which meant I needed a hole. But this would obviously cause issues with epoxy leaking out. So I just filled it with as much caulk as I could, making sure to wiggle the wires to fill any gaps. Then I came back later with 5-minute epoxy to make sure it was completely sealed. Now it was time to start the epoxy pours. I had only planned to do 2, but as we'll see, I made so many mistakes I had to actually do 4 to cover them up. Of the 2 I had actually intended, the first pour was going to be very thin but darker to help hide the LEDs and wires. Then the second was going to be a much lighter and deeper to help diffuse the light. For the first pour, I just used tape to create a dam and sealed the edge with a bit of paint. For the second pour, my plan was to use some leftover plywood I had that I would then cover with epoxy tape and mold release to prevent the epoxy from sticking to it. I also knew from watching Cam at Blacktail Studio and John Malecki's channel that wood actually floats in epoxy, so typically what they do is they clamp down their slabs from the top. However, I couldn't do that as I needed to completely submerge my tabletop in epoxy, so my plan was to simply screw up from the bottom of the mold to hold it down. This part didn't quite go to plan, as you'll see. I wanted about a 3/4 inch overhang of epoxy around all the sides of the plywood, so I made the mold oversized. My thinking here was, I only needed tape on the sides and the first 2 inches of the mold bottom along the outsides because I could use caulk to seal it from getting under the plywood. In hindsight, I should have put tape everywhere. I'll get to that in a moment. Next, I needed to cut a hole through the bottom so the wires could come through and the plywood could sit flush with the bottom. With all that ready, I put down a bead of caulk, laid the plywood centered in the mold and screwed it from underneath, and it was ready for the big epoxy pour. I had bought 6 gallons of deep pour epoxy on Amazon called Nick Pro Epoxy, which was literally the cheapest epoxy I could find on Amazon. I don't make these tables for any clients as I don't have any, so I'm okay with saving money where I can. For whatever reason, epoxy is just really expensive. As of recording this voiceover, total boat thickset is about $130 a gallon, but Nick Pro is about $47 a gallon.
I was a little bit worried that it would turn out terribly, but honestly, it turned out pretty good. Longevity might be an issue, but so far it feels pretty solid. I'll put a link in the description in case any of you want to try it out. So now it was time to mix up the Nick Pro. My plan was to mix the first 3 gallons, do the pour, mix the next 3 gallons, and do another pour. I wasn't too worried about getting a uniform look, as this was a Starry Night table, so any distortions or unevenness would just add to the look. So I began. I mixed up the first 3 gallons and added a copious amount of white glitter with a sparingly small amount of black dye, and I began pouring. I noticed the first signs of disaster shortly after. A few drops started dripping down where the wires came out, then a few more. Then it became a steady stream. I instantly went into panic mode. This would soon be a disaster if I didn't stop it, because a leak like this would completely drain out all of the epoxy onto the floor. I jumped into action. I've seen on Cam's channel he uses Flex Seal in situations like this. Damn, if only I had some. I did, however, have C8 glue. It's like a super glue that you spray with an activator and it instantly dries. So I tilted the mold to drain the epoxy away temporarily, and I took the C8 glue and started liberally applying it to the very large hole and gave it a spray with the activator. Fun fact about C8 glue, when it dries, it becomes incredibly hot. The reason I know this is because I thought it would be easier to apply C8 glue to my fingertips and then smear it into the hole. The problem is that there was still activator on the hole, and immediately my fingertips started burning. Thankfully, not so bad, it actually left marks. The C8 glue wasn't working, the hole was just too wide. The last thing I had was caulk, so again I just shoved and lathered as much of it into the hole to see if that would work, but the epoxy just pushed it aside because it hadn't cured. At this point I was terrified. My heart was literally pumping in my chest as all I could think about was 3 gallons of epoxy solidifying on the garage floor and then my wife finding out and murdering me in my sleep. I had one last idea. I figured I might be able to caulk on the inside of the form where the plywood met the mold. So I once again tilted the form to drain the epoxy to the side, and I began squeezing caulk into the space when I realized I hadn't screwed the plywood down all the way, leaving about a 1/4 inch gap at the bottom, which was a complete idiot move. I had literally just left a giant hole in the bottom. So I tightened the screws and added a few more for good measure and tested the leak. Thankfully, that seemed to have done the trick. There is a website called Reddit, and on there is a subreddit called Shitty Life Pro Tips, so I thought I would give you my own Shitty Life Pro tip. If you want to speed up the curing time of your epoxy, then move to Texas in the summer and don't get AC in your garage. A cool 95 degrees Fahrenheit will make your epoxy pours and your life so much better. In order to prevent my epoxy from cracking as it dried, I used fans to help keep it cool, which worked surprisingly well. About 2 days later, it was time to demold. The sides came out pretty easy, but that was about it. Yeah, my tabletop was essentially epoxied right to the mold. The only way I knew how to get it out was to use these wedges and just hammer on them until the plywood delaminated. And this is exactly what I did. I just kept hammering on it and breaking the plywood base until it was free.
I was wondering why this thing wasn't popping off like it should, like in the videos I've seen, and I realized, look at that. There's a little bit of epoxy that kind of came from the bottom. There's a little bit of epoxy that seeped around the kind of the silicone, the caulk gasket I put down. So this means it's pretty much epoxy to the background. Oh shoot! And I forgot the screws. Oh my god, I forgot the screws. I gotta take those screws out. Holy crap!
During this entire process, I was pretty worried that my LEDs would fail, as this was putting a lot of tension on those wires and solder joints.
Okay, so I'm incredibly worried that the LEDs are broken or solder joint has come off because I was hammering on this thing to get it out, and the epoxy's still just a little bit movable, not quite fully set up. It made it a lot easier to clean up some of the stuff on the backside, but it is caused me a lot of concern for the LED strength and if they're actually going to work. So I have here a tester chip that I've soldered to the three of the pins. And if I plug this in, it'll get power. And what should happen is a red light should run across all of the LEDs to the very end. And if that happens, then it's working and everything's okay. We can actually salvage this problem. So let's go ahead, plug this in and see what happens. 3, 2, 1. Okay, it still works. Let's see if it makes it to the end. If there's any breaks anywhere along the line, it'll stop right there. And we know how many are broken. But if it makes it all the way to the far corner, then we know it's all good. Oh my god. And then it just starts over. Oh my god, I cannot believe that works. I am so happy that worked. This thing was like moving up and down a little bit. Like I would like wrench on it and it would come up just a little bit. And all those LEDs were under tension. All the solder joints were under tension. I'm happy that I had a solid backing for the LEDs and I put that other coat of epoxy on it, because without that, it probably wouldn't have been rigid enough to survive that. Oh my god, I'm so happy about this. Well, let's keep going. I'm going to try and salvage the back. I also noticed that, well, you probably can't see, but some of these wires kind of got stripped somehow. There's like 2 wires that got stripped in there, almost to the point they're completely bare. I'm not powering those ones to test. Excuse me, I'm a little bit sick. I'm not powering those ones to test at the moment, but I'm gonna have to deal with that. What I actually might do is, because if you look right here, it's actually pretty good wire up there, pretty clean wire. So I might just put them all down there, resolder all of them, because yeah, I don't want to deal with all this crap on the wires. So let's flip it over again, and I'm gonna try and salvage the back. I think I have an idea.
After getting it out, I decided the only way I could fix this was with more epoxy. So I ran to my local Woodcraft and grabbed a half gallon and poured it in. But this wasn't enough, so I ordered another gallon on Amazon and poured that in, which finally got me the even, consistent look I was going for. Just so we're clear, we're at 4 different pours with 4 different brands of epoxy at this point. So I flipped the table over once more and started using my festival track saw to cut off the excess. My plan now was to sand this up to about 400 grit and then finish sanding it later. It was time to move on to the electrical and software components. I bought this simple electrical box on Amazon for like $7 that was perfect for the housing. I connected everything up, including a 12 amp fuse and on-off switch that had a very satisfying click, and I connected my LED control board for a quick test to make sure everything was working.
I made all the electrical connections, and I've connected this little Arduino board here just as a tester to see if the LEDs are still going to work. So I've connected all the power injection lines. I've connected everything up. And if I plug this into here, 2 things are going to happen. One, you'll see a little red dot start going across all the LEDs just to confirm that they're working. Or nothing will happen, and you're going to hear some popping, maybe perhaps a little bit of smoking. And all the work I put into this table is completely wasted because I'm not getting those LEDs out to repair them. So I'm actually pretty nervous, and I haven't tried this off camera. This is the first time. So I'm going to plug this in. Hopefully we start seeing some light. If anything but light happens, like a little red dot happens, I just spent like a month and like $500, and it's all wasted. So 3, 2, 1. Oh my God, it's working. Oh my God.
It's working! It's working!
Oh, check this out. Check this out. See that? See that? Let's wait for it to come back. It's just going up and down all the LEDs. It's working. I'm so freaking happy. All right. So next step is to actually do the programming. So I don't know if you guys know this, but I'm a software engineer. I've been a software engineer for like 15 years. Not 15 years, like 10 years. I'm not sure why I said 15 years. And so I'm going to try to make this look like real stars. So let's do that now. As a professional software engineer, I know how to use GPT-4 to do as much of my job as possible. And so I created this website called fastai.info to do so. This is a completely free website that lets you talk to the latest OpenAI model, which is GPT-4 Omni at the time of this voiceover. I'll put a link in the description in case you want to check it out. If you think that's helpful, then please subscribe and leave a like. As mentioned, I use GPT-4 a lot in my day job, so here's kind of a sneak preview into how I do it. I wanted to transform the LEDs in the table into looking like stars, so I began by describing what I wanted. I told GPT-4 something like, "Hey, I'm building an epoxy table with LEDs embedded in it as a matrix. Please help me write the code to make them look like stars." And it came up with this. Not quite what I wanted, but after iterating on it for a couple of times, GPT-4 finally got me this. That's kind of how you have to use GPT-4. You kind of have to iterate it and give it suggestions and point it in the right direction.
and then it can generate a lot of code that's actually pretty useful for you. I even had GPT-4 add a supernova animation. Once every 30 seconds, one of these stars will randomly start blinking bright red and kind of explode. Next, I flipped the table over and finished wet sanding up to 3000 grit, and then I began finishing. My plan for finishing this table was to use Odie's oil. On paper, Odie's oil seems like the best finish, even better than Rubio or Osmo that I see other YouTubers use. Full disclaimer, I haven't used any of them yet, and this is my first time using Odie's oil. My reason for saying this is Odie's oil claims to work on any type of material. It's completely waterproof, uses only natural products, simply requires a buff on and buff off, and it smells pretty good too. An additional benefit is you don't need an accelerator like Rubio. I'll see how it holds up in the long term, but what do you guys think about Odie's oil? Let me know in the comments below. One thing I did notice while buffing is it's pretty thick and it takes quite a bit of work to actually buff on and off. I used a Festool sander with like a buffing pad that made it a lot easier, but if you're doing this by hand, I can imagine it would take a lot of work. With that, the table was pretty much finished. I had made this simple black box pedestal to support the top, which I just screwed in with some pocket holes. Then I moved it into the living room and I was done. That's a wrap on this one, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I did hide a constellation somewhere in this tabletop, so if you guys have seen it, please leave a comment below. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. See you in the next one.